So I'm going to talk about social enterprises from a multi-actor power perspective. And before I do so, just a few words about why I think this is a relevant perspective. To put it very shortly, if you look at the social, ecological, and economic challenges that we face all around the world, our starting point in our research is that in order to tackle these challenges, you need to acknowledge the kind of problematic power relations that are underlying a lot of these challenges. And we need to tackle these power relations in order to be able to tackle the societal challenges. So power relations of inequality, oppression, exclusion, exploitation, extraction, injustice, and so on. So then the relevant question becomes is how and to what extent are social enterprises and other types of what we call social innovation, to what extent are they challenging power relations, but also how might they be reproducing them? So a related question is what are the intended power implications, but also the unintended power implications of social innovations such as social enterprises? So we have been studying these kind of questions in all sorts of projects and organizations using many different terminology, ranging from transitions to social innovation to urban justice and sustainability. I'm not going to go into the details of these projects. You can find them all online. What I want to focus on in this presentation is this, of course, the phenomenon of social enterprise that appears as a strong empirical phenomenon in all these different fields. And this particular book that we have edited on plural perspectives on social enterprise, building on these different conceptualizations of different forms of social enterprise around the world. And because time is short, I will focus specifically on our chapter where we develop a multi-actor perspective to look at the transformative potential of social enterprise. So the multi-actor perspective is based on a distinction between different institutional logics. Many of you already know this model. It distinguishes between public and private, for-profit and non-profit, formal and informal, and then you can distinguish between the state, the market, the community, the non-profit sector, and then you have this hybrid sphere where, of course, social enterprises are very much part of this hybrid sphere. And I think that this distinction between informal and formal to kind of look at civil society as consisting of these different dimensions is a very important one when you want to talk about power relations and different kinds of power. Because if you compare my grandmother who lives on the corner of the street to a Greenpeace activist or a Harvard professor of economics, they are all civil society, but I would argue they have quite different, they operate in quite different institutional logics, and you can also attribute different kinds of power to them. What makes this model a multi-actor perspective, how we have further developed it, is by pointing out that when you look at the state, it's not just about politicians and policymakers, but it's also us as citizens and voters. And likewise in the market, it's not just about the companies and the entrepreneurs, but also us as consumers and clients. And in the non-profit sector, it's not just about the activists and the Greenpeace NGOs, but also us when we are members or donate some money or when we volunteer. And then in the community, we play very different roles as residents or neighbors or parents or friends. So the point is that these institutional logics are not about different actors, but rather all of us play different actor roles across all these institutional logics. So if we then go to social enterprise, often social enterprise or social entrepreneurship is associated with something that is typically in the market. So we have also studied in our chapter a case study of the Impact Hub network, where it's mostly operates as social entrepreneurs within the market logic. But there's also examples of community-led social entrepreneurship, like the eco-villages of people that buy a piece of land and start over, building their own villages, producing their own energy, growing their own food. And there you also see social entrepreneurship that's more community-led, which Tina has also very clearly presented. But then you also have social enterprise or social entrepreneurship that is more within the state logic, such as participatory budgeting, where citizens get involved in deciding how municipal budgets are spent, for instance, in order to do things that they want to do within their municipality. So there you also see entrepreneurship. And of course, the example of community energy, which was also mentioned before, where people come together to produce their own energy. So we argue that social enterprise emerges across these different institutional logics, and that the shifting relations and also the shifting power relations between these different boundaries and logics is very inherent to social entrepreneurship. And this also means that social enterprise does something within an existing playing field of power dynamics, and that comes with a responsibility to understand what kind of implications it has for existing power relations. Because unlike this model, which is like neat, symmetrical, equally sized triangles, in reality, we could argue that a lot of our Western societies look more like this, where there's a clear dominance of market logic and state logic, especially in welfare state societies, and particularly the public-private partnership between the two of them. So this also means that if you start a social enterprise, it exists within that context, and it has a particular impact within that context, and we need to study how it impacts those power imbalances. And it's not just about those big macro level power imbalances between the state and the market and the community, but also more at a micro level, where it's not just about power relations between state and market, but also if you zoom into the state, there are all these power relations between national and international governments and local governments. Within the market, it's also about large companies and small companies, but also in the community and the nonprofits sectors. It's not like a cozy corner where everything is very peaceful. There's some of the fiercest power struggles are also ongoing there between men and women, for instance, between different ethnicities, different generations, and so on. So we need to pay attention to these micro-political power relations and what kind of how social enterprises affect those. So the argument that we develop in the chapter is that in order to evaluate the transformative potential of social enterprises, the question should be how and to what extent is social enterprise challenging, but also reproducing power relations. And when we ask that question, be very specific about in which context, in which institutional or otherwise context, and also at what level. So we propose to make a distinction between macro level power relations and micro level power relations. Because in a lot of the more critical sociological and political theory debates, there's often a very strong critique of social enterprises for kind of reproducing the neoliberal power relations between state and market. So then it becomes tempting to kind of suggest that a lot of social enterprises are actually reproducing existing power imbalances. But what we showed in our chapter is that you can maybe not challenge power relations at a macro level, but you can still contribute to challenging power relations at the micro level. So for instance, you could, we've seen examples of social enterprises that clearly challenge the existing power imbalances between big companies and small companies. So there is some transformative potential at that more micro level, even if they don't challenge the market logic as a whole. So we argue that we need to be very careful. And another thing to be careful about is to also remember that if there is if power relations are being challenged in one dimension, they can still be reproduced in another dimension. So you especially see this with this discourse and a lot of attention for decentralization, whether it's the decentralization of energy or anything else, that there is a bit of a naive assumption that decentralization of resources, of physical resources and companies that or government, that this will automatically lead to also decentralization of power and that this will also become more fair. But we have seen that decentralization in one place can also lead to recentralization of power elsewhere. So very good examples are Airbnb and Uber, where of course you can debate whether or not they are a social enterprise or whether they even started as one. But at first instance, it looks like there is a decentralization of power, right? Because everybody can become a taxi driver, everybody can rent their room. But if you look closer, you see that there's actually a recentralization of power within the platform companies. But rather than becoming cynical about these platform developments and the digital transformation in general, it's then interesting to look at these social enterprise initiatives that are really seeing how they can take the interesting aspects of these developments, but do that in a social and cooperative way, as Tina de Moor also mentioned with the platform cooperativism, but also initiatives like, for instance, Airbnb that try to be an ethical alternative to Airbnb. And likewise, when you look at renewable energy, it's very easy to imagine how this will help to distribute power and decentralize power from companies and governments to kind of the people. But when you look at these happy pictures of community energy initiatives, it's equally important to ask who is not on this picture, who is being excluded, and what kind of implications does that have for existing power imbalances. But then again, not get cynical, which is sometimes where power analysis tends to end, but then really actively look for new partnerships, for instance, between local governments and citizen initiatives that are trying to see how, for instance, the revenues of renewable energy can be reinvested, not just for the private initiatives, but also to see how we can deal with energy poverty at a municipal level, for instance. So to conclude, one of the questions that I'm now working on and very intrigued by is this question of mainstreaming, where often when people talk about mainstreaming and in the context of social enterprise, it's a lot about marketization and commodification. But there is, of course, also this whole issue of bureaucratization and standardization, and likewise, socialization and communalization. So these are all different forms of mainstreaming and institutionalization, and each of these comes with their own power dynamics and challenges. So one of the big research questions I'm struggling with is how can social enterprises and other social innovations that aim to contribute to just sustainability transitions, how can they be mainstreamed and gain power while at the same time maintaining their transformative potential? So that's the research question I'm working on. If you have any tips, suggestions, publications, please share in our collective Google Doc in answering this question. But for now, I want to invite you in the World Café to discuss the following question, which is basically going back to where I started at the beginning of the presentation. In your studies, research and experience, how and to what extent are social enterprises challenging, but also reproducing power relations? Or if it calls more to you, if it resonates more to you, you can also talk about what are the intended, but also the unintended power implications of social enterprises. So Vaishali will share again with you these questions in the current chat. Also, when you're in the groups, you will have a broadcast of the questions to remind you. And please remember to also have the Google Doc that Vaishali sends in the chat to have it at hand so that you can take some notes. Of course, you don't need to take entire minutes, but just some insights. And if you're interested in ordering the book, you can now finally pre-order the affordable paperback. And if you still cannot afford those 30 euros, then you can also find all the chapters as accepted manuscripts. Okay, now I'll stop sharing. And wish you lots of fun in the final breakout, which you'll have really 15 minutes at least. And then when we come back, we'll have a Q&A, not just about my presentation, but about all presentations so far.